And I'm glad to see all of you. Thank you for joining us. And today I'm happy to introduce Alina Adams. Alina is the author of the book The Nesting Dolls, a very interesting book that represents the history of family, of Jewish family, starting with three generations of family, starting from Odessa. And actually, we see that three of us, Alina Bitel, Alina Adams, and me, all of us are from Odessa. And then a long trip of immigration up to the United States and Little Odessa, Brighton Beach. But the uniqueness of our meeting today will be that we will not only talk about the book, about the personal history of Alina Adams, but it will be a kind of workshop of how to create family history. So this is a unique opportunity, and Alina, thank you again that for your time that you are here, and so the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, Yigal. Thank you to Kajeko. Thank you, Alina Bitel, for introducing me. And most of all, thank you all for coming. I know that these days, the last thing anybody wants to do at the end of the day is to get on another Zoom call. So I am extremely appreciative of everyone who took the time to come and to listen to me. My presentation today will be in three parts. I'll talk a little bit about my own personal family history, both the specific and the general. Then I'll talk about how that family history influenced the writing of my book, The Nesting Dolls. And then I will talk about how you can take your own family history, either your own specific story or a broader story from your family, and the various ways you have of getting it out there, whether it's only because you want to do it for your children or your grandchildren, or because you'd like to see broader publication. So those are the things that I'm going to cover. As Alina said, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I'm very comfortable keeping an eye on the chat as it's going on. So if you have a particular question about something I'm talking about, please type it in the chat. I will ask you to type it in English. Here's the thing, while I understand Russian, if I have to actually stop and read Russian very slowly, it won't be pretty for any of us. So please put the question in English and I will get to it. Once again, thank you for coming, and I'm going to get started. So the first thing is, Yigal introduced me as Alina Adams, and that is, as I like to say, my Goyish name. But when I was born, I was Alina Gendrichovna Sivarinovskaya. I was born in Odessa, USSR. And for the first 6 years of my life, this is a story that I'm sure won't come as a shock to all of you, I lived in a single room with my parents in a communal apartment. We shared with another family who also had a child about my age and their mother. The families shared the kitchen. We shared the bathroom. We were actually very lucky in that my parents got along well with the family that they were assigned to. So we didn't have the stories that you'd hear from other families of, you'd put your pot of soup to cook and leave the kitchen for a moment. And when you returned, you found out it had been dumped in the sink. Or you hung up your laundry and you returned to find out it had been thrown out the window. So my parents were actually very fortunate. And in fact, in Brighton Beach, that family ended up emigrating as well. And they're still in touch. That wasn't everybody's story. The classic story is, again, I don't think it'll come as a surprise to many people, is there were Soviet apartments where not only could people not trust to leave their toilet paper in the bathroom because other people would steal it, but they couldn't even trust to leave their toilet seat. So you had to come and bring your toilet seat, and there would be pegs on the walls outside the bathroom where people would hang.
Alina, my apologies.
Did you interrupt me, Alina?
Yeah, my apologies. Something I think is off with your connection because you froze on our screen. If you could.
Do you want me to? I can stop video and start it again. That sometimes helps.
Perhaps let's try that because we.
Let me see if does that make a difference?
Meanwhile, it works. So we'll see.
Yeah, it works.
Okay.
So let's go with it.
I'll just keep, but worst comes to worst, I'll do it as a radio drama. So, so those were the first 6 years of my life. The final year that we lived in the USSR, my father's mother, my grandmother, got a newly made building in an area called Tairova. I don't know if people were familiar with it, that had been promised to her. She was a war widow. Her husband had died during World War II. She had been promised widow's housing in 1945. She finally got it in 1976. So then we were able to move. But at that point, my parents had had enough, and we immigrated to the United States. We took the familiar route, which I'm sure a lot of people know about, through Lvov, through Chop, from Vienna, through Rome. And here's the thing. I was 7 years old. There were a lot of socio-political details, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, the Free Soviet Jewry movement, all of those things. I was 7 years old. I was not aware of any of those things that were happening. I didn't even know we were leaving the Soviet Union, because my parents were afraid that if they told me, I would tell other people. So I didn't know we were leaving. Now, here's an interesting thing. Those of you know that in the Soviet Union, you start first grade when you're 7 years old. First grade is September 1st. It's a huge holiday. Everybody puts on their uniforms, the girls in their nice white pinafores. There's flowers. There's great festivities. We were scheduled to leave Odessa on September 20th. My parents had a lot more going on in their lives than sending me to school. So it's September 1st. Everybody's going off to school. I'm sitting at home like the village idiot. I have no idea why. I don't know what's going on. So it was only when we got to the train station and my father's mother was crying hysterically, which didn't make any sense to me because we were just going on a short trip, that I was finally let in on the fact that we were leaving and that we would not be coming back and we'd be going to this mysterious place called America. Now, as I said, there were a lot of political details to this story, but here's the story that stuck with me because I'm 7 years old. So we land in New York City. We're going on to San Francisco. We didn't. And in fact, when we were in Rome, my father got two offers, one to go to San Francisco, California, and one to go to New Jersey. And he didn't really know the difference. So he went to the volunteer in Rome and he said, you know, I have these two offers. I could go to San Francisco. I could go to New Jersey. Which one should I pick? And the American volunteer said to him, you have a chance to go to San Francisco and you're even considering New Jersey? Now, this is with all due apologies to the people of New Jersey. My brother currently lives in New Jersey. My son currently goes to college in New Jersey. Okay, well, my son currently goes to college in a room off my house. But as my husband likes to say, we send checks to a college in New Jersey. So that's no insult meant to the people of New Jersey. It's just as a setting to say that we're going to San Francisco. But first, we have to spend the night in New York City. So we're in New York City and we spend the night. It was also the first time I saw color television. It was very, very exciting. Now, through this whole trip that I had gone through, from Odessa to Lvov, to Chop, to Vienna, to Rome, the only constant in my life was this black teddy bear. It's the thing that I held the whole time. It was the only consistent thing. So in New York, we spend the night in a hotel. We get up, you know, we're all wearing layers of clothes because that way you don't have to put things in your suitcases to be shipped. So luckily it's January. The people who had to wear layers in July were probably a lot hotter. So it's January. And we get to the airport at JFK, or maybe it was LaGuardia. I have no idea. Remember, I'm 7. And we're waiting for the plane to San Francisco. And then a discovery is made. The teddy bear is missing. Okay. Do any of you have children? Do any of you have grandchildren? Do any of you have children who are attached to one particular item? Do you know what happens when that item goes missing? Now, here's the issue. We're at the airport still kind of quasi-legally because we're supposed to go to San Francisco. We have those HIAS stickers on us. Who remembers the HIAS, Hebrew International Aid Society, stickers on our clothes? I think, yeah, we're basically baggage, I think, at this point. We can't leave the airport. We also have like maybe $100 to our name because that's all my parents were allowed to take out of the USSR. Now, this story makes more sense if you understand my father. My father is a very logical, practical, sensible man. The only reason to do something is there has to be a good, logical, practical, sensible reason. But I believe I've mentioned the teddy bear is missing. So my logical, practical, sensible father sneaks away from the Hias group, which he's not supposed to do. He gets into a cab, which he barely has the money for. He takes the cab back to the hotel. He says to the person there, we need to find the teddy bear. The person says, we've already cleaned the room. He says, find me the maid who cleaned the room. They find him the maid who cleaned the room. The maid said, I cleaned the room. I didn't find any teddy bear. My father says, take me down to the laundry where you drop the sheets. My father digs through the sheets. My father finds the teddy bear. My father gets back in the cab. He comes back to the airport in time for us to go to San Francisco because the teddy bear is missing. And the reason that I tell you this story, besides it's my most vivid memory of immigration, well, besides like maybe the food in Vienna, and who remembers the open market in Rome where I saw food that I'd certainly never seen before, but that's my most dominant memory. And the reason I mention it to you is because we're going to bring up a lot the concept of little stories versus big stories. The big story is the Free Soviet Jewry movement, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, the PLO bombing airports. Those are all the big international stories that you can research and you can read in the newspaper. But it's the little stories that make narratives. And I'm going to keep bringing them up as we go along. And I want you to start thinking as we get into the workshop portion about these little stories, these intimate stories, the ones that bring people to life, the ones that are only yours, the ones that you can't research, because we're going to do a little project with that as we get closer towards the workshop portion. So as I mentioned, we're in San Francisco now, where I'm put into a school where everyone is English speaking, although it was a Jewish day school. And I do like to say that I was advantaged in that I didn't speak English or Hebrew. So I didn't speak both of them equally. And this was either before English language learners or the school was too small. And the idea was it should be all immersion. The only English words I knew were the word apple, because it was the first picture in this English language storybook I had, and the word the. How do you translate the word the? What does the mean? But that was basically my English vocabulary as I went into second grade at an American school where I learned all sorts of interesting things. And I don't know if this is something that some of you may have experienced, especially if you came to the US as a child. Do you know that in America, you wear a different outfit to school every day? I didn't know that. Did you know that in America, if you go swimming at a public pool, little girls don't just wear underpants? They actually wear complete bathing suits? I didn't know that. Did you know that in America, there's a holiday, which as my grandmother described, where they go begging door to door for food and you're supposed to dress up in a costume? I didn't know that. Did you know that there's a holiday in America where people give you cards for seemingly no reason? So that 2 weeks later, when I got a card that was an invitation to a birthday party, I thought it was just, oh, it's another day where you give people cards. And I didn't know there was anything I was supposed to do about it. So these were all things I learned. Did you know that in America, sandwiches have 2 pieces of bread instead of being open? Did you know that a cotilletta is not a hamburger? These are all things that I eventually learned. And here's something else I learned. 2 things, really. In America, if you fall down and get a cut and your father puts green stuff on it, people will ask questions. And here's one more thing. Did you know that in America, if you have a cold, the solution is not to either put mustard in your socks or to put your feet in boiling water. And it is definitely under no circumstances to do banki. Who knows what banki are? Anybody remember banki? Thank you, Will and Hannah and anyone else if I see you raising your hand. So for those who have not had the thrilling experience of banki, Will already thinks like Will knows where this story is going. Where if you consider a light bulb made out of thick glass. And what you do is you take, at least this is how my father did it. In your homes, it may have been done differently. and you take a wire and you wrap some gauze or some cotton around it. And then you dip the gauze and the cotton in either perfume or some kind of alcohol, and you set it on fire. So now you have a torch and you have a glass bulb. And you put the fire in the glass bulb, and what it does is it sucks out the oxygen, and then you put the glass bulb on your back, and it makes a sucking sound. Because the idea is it's going to expand your blood vessels, and you will recover because your blood is circulating better. But about a half hour later, when you remove the banca is the plural, banca is one, it leaves a perfect purple bruise. And if you are a child, and you come to school with, say, 12 or 16 perfect purple bruises on your back, people will also ask questions. These are all things that I did not know until I came to America. I see nodding. So I see these were people who also perhaps did not know that this is something that happens until it happened to them. If you'd like to share your banki or any other Soviet medicine experience in the comments, I'd be happy to hear it. But basically, these were all things that I learned from the American educational system. Oh, Amy didn't know about that practice. Well, Amy, you are lucky. I mean, it doesn't hurt. The fact of the matter is they don't hurt. It's just that the bruises they leave are worse than the actual process. So I survived school eventually, and my parents survived not having Child Protective Services called on them. And eventually, I've known I wanted to be a writer from the time I was very little. And I started out sending out proposals for books. And this is and you know what they say? They say, write what you know. Well, here's what I knew when I was 20 years old. I only knew how to be a Soviet immigrant. And the only thing I knew that was vaguely interesting was, the Soviet history and the history of Jewish immigration and all of that. So I would send out book proposals. By the way, this is back in the days before the internet. So you would have to send your manuscript with a self-addressed stamped envelope so they could return it. So you were basically paying for them to reject you. And this was something that I did. And the feedback that I got back universally was, Russia doesn't sell. No one is interested in reading about Russia. Russia is not a topic that we published books in. I did have one editor at Avon Books say to me, I usually publish new authors in Regency Romance. Do you think you could write me a proposal for one? And I said, sure. And then I hung up the phone and I said, what's a Regency Romance? So I went to the library and I checked out a stack of books. It turned out Regency Romances are romance novels set during the Regency period in England, which these days people know because of Bridgerton. Basically, Bridgerton is a classic Regency romance written by Julia Quinn, who's actually Jewish, for those who didn't know that, who's a very well-known Regency Romance author. But at the time, it was more like in the style of Jane Austen. So here's the thing. They're asking me, I was 22-year-old Soviet Jewish immigrant, to write a romance set in Regency England. Write what you know. So I put a Jew in the story. There were some Jews in Regency England. I did do some research. There was a small number, but they were there. So I did a proposal. I sent it off to the editor. A week later, she calls me and she says, I love it. Can I have the rest of the manuscript on my desk by the end of the week? And I said, it's not polished yet, because that was better than saying it's not written yet. So I ended up writing the manuscript. That became my first published book. That's also where my name, Alina Adams, came from. The editor actually came up with it because somehow she didn't think Alina Siverinovsky screamed Regency England. So that was my first book. And, this was in 1994. So I hadn't given it really a lot of thought. And then last year, I saw that it was actually on a list from Romance Writers of America as the first Jewish historical Regency romance. At the time, I had no idea that I was writing anything, beyond just trying to get a book published. So it was called Our Own Voices, because with all the talk these days about diversity and letting people speak for themselves and letting their own experience speak, it became the first Jewish Regency romance. So who knew? I didn't know. So this is actually something else that I'm going to talk about for those who want to write more professionally. And I'll talk about that a little bit when I get to the workshop piece, is really exploit what makes you unique. And exploit sounds like a bad word, but it's not. It's tell a story that only you can tell. Anybody can tell a generic story that takes place in Middle America. And if that's where you're from, that's great. But if you actually can provide a new voice, if you can provide something new to the conversation, that's what's going to make you stand out in traditional publishing. And in fact, the next thing that I did was after I had done my writing, I ended up working for ABC Sports for their figure skating coverage, because here's two things. Yes, I had a degree in writing for television. Yes, I could write, but I also spoke Russian. It's one of those things where you never know what aspect of your life is going to be an advantage. And when ABC Sports can either hire two people, one to do the writing and one to be a translator, or they can hire one person and pay them only one salary, and they can speak Russian and do the writing, then that's what I was able to do. I was able to take advantage of something that was unique to me. And as a result of that, I ended up writing a series of figure skating murder mysteries that take place in the world of skating. This happened right after the 2002 Olympics, when they had the scandal with the judges, the figure skating judging scandal. So again, because I had worked in figure skating and knew the figure skating world and knew the Russian skating world, I was able to write a series of 5 figure skating murder mysteries that were published by Berkeley Prime Crime. So as this went on, and I wrote the figure skating murder mysteries. Then I worked for 2 soap operas, As the World Turns and Guiding Light, and I wrote some books that were tied in with them. And all the while I kept trying to pitch more personal projects, but that isn't what people wanted to publish. And then about 3 years ago, I was having lunch with my agent, and she said, you know, Russia is really hot right now. And I said, you don't say. I can't imagine why. And she said, you know, something else editors have told me is, she says, editors are tired of the Holocaust. You can see that. That wasn't a good time for anyone. But they're really tired of publishing Holocaust books over and over again, and they'd like something new. And I said, hey, what about the Soviet Union? You can do the Stalinist Great Terror in the 1930s. You can still have Jewish persecution, but it won't be the Holocaust. Yay. So I ended up coming up with the idea of what became my book, The Nesting Dolls, which takes place during 3 time periods. Odessa in the 1930s, which, as I mentioned, is Stalin's Great Terror. Odessa in the 1970s, which is the Great Stagnation and the Soviet Jewry movement and all that, and present day Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. I got a questions, how were you involved in skating? Oh, I worked for ABC Sports. I was a researcher and a writer for the television broadcast. Like, you know, when Dick Button and Peggy Fleming have clever things to say, usually somebody wrote them for them. Now, nobody writes things for Dick Button. I could write him an entire script and then he would just say whatever he wanted to say. But ostensibly, that's what I was doing. I would sit in the production booth with them, and I'd supply them with all that information. He's the 3rd man from Bulgaria to ever do a quadruple toe loop, that kind of thing. And the figure skating murder mysteries, there's 5 of them. They come from Berkeley Prime Crime, and their names are Murder on Ice, On Thin Ice, Axel of Evil, Death Drop, and Skate Crime. They're all under my name, Alina Adams. Thank you for asking. You can find them on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, the usual suspects. So thank you, Natalia, for asking. So I was saying about how the Nesting Dolls now takes place in those 3 time periods. Now, clearly, I was not an expert in any of those time periods. So that's where I went back to family stories. And this is where I'm going back to what I said earlier. I don't know if any of you have children who know everything. I have children who know everything. And one of the ongoing debates I have specifically with my middle one, my 17-year-old, is he says there's no reason to learn anything because anything you need to know, you can look up. You know, he's got a phone in his pocket that's more powerful than the computers that sent the Apollo to the moon. So he has a point. But the thing I always keep telling him is you can't look something up if you don't know that it exists. You're not going to look up the War of 1812 spontaneously. You have to know there was a War of 1812 to look it up. And it's the exact same here, that when I tackled writing the nesting dolls, I could look up the big events. I knew what year Stalin's doctor's plot was. I knew what year Khrushchev made his speech at, I think it was the 20th Congress, denouncing Stalin. I knew people when they started arresting people in Odessa and deporting them to Siberia. Those were all facts. You can look up facts, but a novel is not facts. A novel is feelings, a novel is character, and a novel is detail. And so the stories that I used for the nesting dolls, a lot of them came straight from my own family. For instance, there is a story where right after the Soviets came to power, they closed in the shtetls, they closed most of the heders, the Jewish schools, and they started doing instruction in Russian, and they started teaching communist ideology. But what that also meant is that it did provide opportunities. My grandfather, my mother's father, when he was 13 years old, okay, those of you who have 13-year-olds, I want you to imagine this. When he was 13 years old, moved by himself from the tiny shtetl where he was born in to Odessa, where he lived in a boarding house, where he went to school at night, where he worked in a factory during the day. And his father, who never spoke Russian, who only spoke Yiddish, wrote a letter to Stalin in Yiddish, thanking Comrade Stalin for this wonderful, amazing opportunity that his son, who would have had nothing if he'd had to stay in the shtetl, that he had. So that's the kind of detail that ends up in the book. On the other hand, my grandmother, my mother's mother, grew up in a family where her parents were extremely proud that their children didn't speak Yiddish, that their children only spoke Russian, because it showed how cosmopolitan they were. It showed how assimilated they were. So that really, those are the kind of details that I couldn't have found if I looked up just the history of even Jews. We have a comment, I always wondered why my grandparents never spoke Yiddish. That was a relatively common attitude. I mean, some people were afraid. Some people thought that, speaking Yiddish would mark you as being Jewish. And in fact, in the nesting dolls, that is what gets the family deported. They speak Yiddish, but someone mistakes it for German. And since there is a dragnet to get German citizens and deported, they get sent away because of that. But in a lot of families, Yiddish was old world. It was embarrassing. I mean, you get that in America too. You have lots of immigrants, not just Jewish immigrants, who come to the US and they don't want their children speaking the other language. They want them speaking English. They want them speaking the language of the country where they live. So again, this is the kind of detail that comes from people that not from something that you can read in a history book. Then when it came to the 1970s, yes, I was born in 1969 and I lived in Odessa until 1976. So I had a few memories, like who remembers, like you could get either soda water or seltzer water, 1 kopeka for the seltzer water, 3 kopeki for the syrup, and you'd go and there's a public, they used to chain the cup because otherwise the winos would come and steal it. There was a cup on a chain and you would put it there and you'd put it in that 1 kopeka, 3 kopeki, and you'd get your soda water, and everybody would use the same glass. And I know we're in a pandemic, so let's all take a moment to think about that. But that's something that that happened. So I had those memories, but the really big memories were my parents, because it's my parents' generation. Now, as I mentioned, they live in San Francisco. I live in New York now, so I'm 3 hours ahead of them. So I would be writing, and then they'd wake up to these emails like, if you were standing on such and such street in 1974 and facing north, what would you see? What does the back of the Odessa Opera Theater look like? Where exactly is the Duke statue? All of that. And then there was specific questions like, the Jewish problems at university exams, when Jews would apply to universities because of quotas, some of them were given unsolvable math problems. That's a detail that I put in there because my father, actually, he wanted to be a doctor, but he was told that he could not be a doctor because he wore glasses. The doctor who told him this wore glasses. So it's that kind of level of details. Or if I would ask them, how much would food cost at this time and where would you get it? Or there's a detailed scene that takes place in a public bathhouse because most people didn't, at least the people I knew in Odessa, most of them didn't have showers and baths in their homes. So they would go and they would line up and they would stand for several hours, and then they would go and they would go into a public bath. Or there's even a scene where the character, he threads a pipe from under the sink, and then he has it go up, and then he hammers in a shelf and puts a bowl on it. And he screws a nozzle into the bowl. And that way, when the pipe fills the bowl, the water comes out and it's a makeshift shower. That's something that my father actually built in our communal apartment. And that's something that I worked into the story. And another one is this: according to my mother, for the first 3 years of my life, I neither ate nor slept. I was a delight. And she kept trying to figure out what was going on. And she thought I was allergic to her milk. And she would go to the clinic and they would say, no, that's impossible. A child cannot be allergic to their mother's milk. And my mother kept begging and pleading. And so finally, when I was 3 months old, they wrote her a prescription for yogurt. Let's all listen to that sentence for a moment. They wrote her a prescription for yogurt. She did not go into the supermarket and say, should it be Chobani? Should it be fruit on the bottom? Should it have probiotics? I don't know which yogurt I should get. She needed a doctor to write her a prescription for yogurt because her baby didn't eat or sleep. Again, those are the kind of personal stories, and I hope you're thinking about what might be in your own families that could be something similar, because those are the details that not only make a character come alive, but they make a time and a place come alive. So that was the 70s. And then the modern section of the Nesting Dolls takes place in 2019. I'll actually tell you a funny story. I wrote that this is taking place in 2019 because the Nesting Dolls was originally supposed to come out in the summer of 2019. But then the publishing house said, you know what, this is a really big book. We think it has a lot of potential. We're going to push it to 2020 where we can give it a really good marketing push. And I was kind of bummed about it because when I read books that are set in the present day and they're like a year or two off, it feels really strange. But it turned out to be an incredibly lucky break because guess what? In the summer of 2020, that story could not have taken place. I have scenes that take place at the Guggenheim Museum where there's lots of people in a room. I have scenes that take place at a comic book store where there's lots of people in a room. These are all things that could not have happened in 2020. So in the end, it actually ended up working out pretty well. So those were the 3 generations that I did. And I want to show you something else. I was very pleased with the cover of the book, the way that it turned out, because here it is. Basically, this is supposed to be Brighton Beach. You got water, you got a bird. This is supposed to be 1970s industrial USSR, and this is Siberia. Now, the title of the book came about because originally I had called it Love is Not a Potato. I don't know how many of you grew up with this expression. In my house, it was very big. Love is not a potato. I didn't know there was a second verse to it. It's love is not a potato. If it goes bad, you can't throw it out the window. I just thought love is not a potato. Okay, well, that's an interesting observation, but I guess that's true. Love is not a potato. So that was the original title. But my agent thought that it sounded too much like a children's book. So when the manuscript was being developed, it was actually called Mother Tongue, because the idea was it has 2 meanings. Mother tongue is the first language that you learn, so it's sort of primal. But the other thing is there's a lot of themes in the book about communication between generations, because one of the things that I definitely learned from having been raised by Soviet parents and Soviet grandparents was this concept that what you think and what you say should be related is a completely bizarre idea. When you're living in a time and a place where anything you say can and will be used against you, whether you said or not, you definitely build up this defense mechanism where there's a complete disconnect between your thoughts and your feelings and your words. On the other hand, here in America, it's all about be yourself, be authentic. If you're not telling the truth about how you really feel, that it's some kind of a betrayal, especially when it comes to personal relationships. So a lot of the conflicts that happens between the mothers and daughters in this book has to do from that American concept of being true to yourself and the Soviet concept of A, why would you do that? And B, it would never even occur to you. So mother tongue had that double meaning. But eventually the editor thought that it sounded too much like a nonfiction manuscript. So we really tried to come up with another title. We brainstormed. She wanted to use old country and love, and there was just a lot of words being thrown around. So I went to that arbiter of all things, Facebook, and I asked my friends what they thought would be a good title, and a friend of mine came up with The Nesting Dolls. Not only does it have the Russian connotation, but it's so perfect because, as I said, here's it is. Siberia, 1970s USSR, Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. All of us inside of us carry all the generations that came before. And that's what a nesting doll is. It's a doll inside of a doll inside of a doll. So the theme really came together well, and the cover artist did a terrific job, and it ended up working out really well. And that's how the book came to be called The Nesting Dolls. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask if anybody has any questions about the historical pieces that I talked about before I move on to more sort of nitty-gritty workshop part of how you too can tell stories. So while you actually think about it, I'm going to show you something that I did, which was, it was a mock-up for a children's book that I just did to read to my kids about the great missing teddy bear story. I took the story and I wrote it as if it were a children's book. Here's us in the airport in Rome. I don't know if you all have those photos as well, that everybody's like dressed up in suits and ties to go on an airplane. And then there is us in New York at the airport. I have the teddy bear back as a great part of the drama. And of course, a close-up of me and the infamous teddy bear. So it was the kind of thing that when my kids were little, I turned it into a children's story that I could read to them, that wasn't a matter of, let's sit down and I am now going to lecture you on your family history. It was much more something organic, the way that you would read any books. And that's something that you can do. One of the best things that I suggest, because when we started this, I told you to start thinking about very specific stories that could either make one narrative or something that's a really good example of the experience that you went through. And one of the best triggers is photos, especially old family photos. And they don't have to be something dramatic, because very few people gets pictures taken during a revolution or an uprising or anything else. But there was one photo that my mother sent me in which she's a little girl. She's about 12 or 13 with her father. And all I asked her was, what year was this? Because I just wanted to date it. That was it. And when she looked at it, she said, that was the first May Day after Stalin died. I believe he died in March of 1953. So that would have been the first May Day, the 1st of May. And then completely unprovoked, she said, when Stalin died, my mother took all the newspapers that had his pictures, and she was afraid to throw them away, because if she was afraid if she put them in the garbage, somebody would say she was putting pictures of Stalin in the garbage, and who knows what that could lead to. So she kept them in a drawer. And then she said when Khrushchev denounced Stalin at the 20th Congress, she took the photos and she burned them all, because now she was afraid that somebody would think that she had photos of Stalin and she must be a supporter. And that was a story that literally came from me just asking, what year was this photo? And that's what triggered it. So that's something, don't look for dramatic photos. Just ask them, what year is this? Or ask them, who is this? Because sometimes saying, oh, that's your second cousin, Lev. And then all this comes out that they start telling you what Lev did, even though they might have never mentioned it before and might have never thought to tell you the story. I have a question is, do you still have this teddy bear? Yes, I do. I do have the teddy bear. He's not as limber as he used to be. I mean, I had to kind of sew his arm back on, and one of his eyes fell out, so I had to replace it with paper. But yes, I still have the bear. I don't know if that's sweet or pathetic, but I still have that bear. So, and that's another thing. The fact is, is there a toy? Who's that bear? Or even in a photo, what's that rocking horse? Or who is that rocking you? Those are the kind of things that can really get people talking, especially those of you who might want to interview parents or grandparents or older people. Because here's what happens. People say, tell me about your childhood, and you get a blank look because people don't know where to start and they don't know what to do. So I suggest don't ask something that general. Ask them something very specific, as simple as, what was your favorite toy? when you were little? Or what did you eat? Because what did you eat leads to the story of, yes, and my mother had to stand 4 hours in line to get fresh carrots because that was the only vitamins that I could get. Or even ask them, who are you named after? These are the kind of things that really get people talking, because when you ask too general of a question, you get, oh, I was a kid, I did kid things, and that sort of things. Any advice if you don't have access to your parents' families or their photos? Well, there are historic records. Here's something I'll tell you. I'll tell you a funny story. This does tie into this. My oldest son did an internship in Moscow the summer of 2019. My husband thinks he was writing propaganda for Putin. We're not really sure what he was doing, but he did it through college. And so we wanted to visit him, and I needed to get a visa. And it turns out that in order to get a visa, from Russia, I needed to show them my original papers that I had immigrated in 1977 and gave up my Soviet citizenship. I don't have those papers. I don't know where they are. But I was able to contact HIAS with the name and the date, and they found it. I cannot tell you how excited I was about this. I was stunned they had records that detailed. I mean, I was a kid. I wouldn't have even known that they had that. So if you don't have access to your parents, to your grandparents, try organizations like that. Sometimes local UJA sponsored families. In fact, very often local Jewish federations would say, oh, that family, he's a dentist. This is an area where we could probably find him work. So reach out to organizations like that. I was stunned by the fact that they kept those records. And that could be a very good starting point, because once you have a date when they arrived, you can also find out other people who came at that time. They might have stories to share. So it was an amazing resource that I just learned about recently. Did that answer your question, Vaska? I'm just going to keep going. If you have other questions, please go ahead and put them there. So one of the things that people then ask me is about, how do I get published? Well, back in the day, published only meant one of two things. It either meant you get a publishing house to buy the rights to your story, and then they published it and they put it out as a book at Barnes & Noble or Walden Books. Or you printed it, you paid for it in that you wrote it yourself, you had it printed, you sold them out of the back of the car, which some people did and became bestsellers from. But that was really used to be the only two options. Now you have so many more, and it doesn't have to cost you huge amounts of money. For instance, both Amazon and Barnes & Noble allow you to both publish things electronically for free and also to do what's called print on demand, which means when someone orders a copy of a book, they pay for it directly, so the costs aren't yours. And this works whether you want to make 100 copies to give out at a family reunion, or whether you want to try to sell it to a broader market. So there's a lot more options, and also there's multimedia. Think about videotaping older people using their photos. You can then scan those photos and make a video presentation of it. Again, my 14-year-old, she has a YouTube channel, and she edits stuff that when I first started in TV, we were so excited when we got non-linear editing because it was digital and you had to turn tape into digital copies, and then you were able to edit on a huge machine that then took an hour to format it. Nah. You can do it all on your laptop when you're 14 or even younger. So it's a great chance you can digitize your photos. You can put the voices of the older people underneath it. You can put in music. You can do all these things, and you put them up on YouTube. If you just want to share them with your family, or again, if you want to share them with the world. Right now, actually, marketing and public relations is kind of the more important skill, because publishing is open to a lot of people. You can edit yourself, or you can hire someone to do it. I don't want to dwell too much on the money piece because that's not really the important thing. What I'd love to do now, and I'm not pressuring anyone, I'm just going to give people a couple of minutes to think about whether there are stories, like the reason I told you the teddy bear stories, because it was very specific, but it's very meaningful to me and said something about my immigration experience. If there's any stories in your life that you think encompasses a person or a place or a moment, and how you think you might be able to tell that story, whether it's a children's book, whether it's a video, whether it's a family history, whether it's taking your family history and fictionalizing it. The fact is, a lot of the stories that I put into the nesting dolls, my kids won't sit around to listen to. But maybe if they're between the covers of the book, not that they've read the book, but eventually they might. The 21-year-old did. He said, wow, you had a lot of trauma. I'm like, wow, you learned a lot of buzzwords at college. But it really, someday, I hope they will. So there's all sorts of ways to tell a story and all sorts of stories. So I'm just going to be quiet for a minute. I've been talking nonstop for like 40 minutes already. Wow. So if anybody would like to share, or if anyone has a question about how they can tell this particular story, I'm here to answer.
Well, everyone should have an opportunity to unmute themselves right now. So if you'd like to.
Я хочу сказать, что мне очень интересно, но ваша история практически повторила историю моих двух детей. Моя старшая девочка Алина выехала тоже в возрасте 6 лет. Тоже мы приехали в Америку, и тоже мы не имели... We had no idea, что мы должны менять в школу девочки каждый день аутфит. Но не говоря о том, что у меня даже не было денег на эти аутфитс, но я меняла кофточку ей каждый день, а сарафанчик оставался тот же. А учительница была настолько умна, что она подошла к 6-летнему ребенку и сказала: передай, пожалуйста, маме, что она тебе должна поменять платьице. И мы шли в магазин, Эймс, по-моему, он тогда назывался, самый дешевый. И мы давали себе слово, что мы обязательно купим платьице. Но у нас не хватало денег. И история с Teddy Bear тоже мне очень знакома. Мы уже рожденному в Америке ребенку, мы полетели в Дрезден с нашим Teddy Bear, и guess what, мы его там забыли. И нам стоило 60-70 евро его пересылать из Дрездена. Спасибо вам большое, очень интересно. А история про такси, я где-то читала, это было паблиш в Нью-Йоркер или еще что-то, потому что я книгу только взяла в библиотеке, я еще не прочитала.
Вы читаете Квеллер?
Может быть, я очень много получаю всякой...
Она была напечатана пару лет назад в журнале Квеллер, может быть, вы тогда видели.
Я читала эту историю. Спасибо большое, очень интересная презентация.
There's a note here. There is the Wexler Family History Center at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst. They will interview on Zoom, edit the video, and save it for posterity online. They have videos of many well-known people on their website. That's great. Are they open to everyone, Olga? Do you just sign up? How does it work?
Hi. You have to apply on their website. There is a questionnaire, and they choose whom they are going to interview. But anybody from our generation, and I'm older than you a little bit, and easy, I got interviewed. There is another person in our audience right now who was interviewed by them. I don't want to say her name. She's a personal friend. If she chooses to out herself, that's fine. But you just look Wexler Family History Project or Yiddish Book Center, and there are questionnaires. They're very easy to deal with. The best part is that they can interview you in either English, Russian, or Yiddish. They have people who do both, all three. So it's very friendly, it's very easy, it's fun.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing it. If everybody looks over into the chat, they'll see Olga wrote down the name of it, Wexler Family History Center at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now there's a question about treading lightly with political themes about leaving and risk associated with certain kinds of stories. Do you mean if you want to get a book published? I mean, you can unmute yourself, Will, and tell me what exactly you're asking. What kind of risk are you asking about?
Well, so one of the stories that we have when we came over, a lot of these always make me emotional. So I apologize in advance if I get a little emotional with some of these stories. And yours were great too, obviously. But when we left in 1980, and half of our family was not allowed to come, and half of us were allowed to come, and it kind of tore people apart. But some folks had who stayed behind, if they found out, they being the Soviet Union, other government agencies where the folks worked, that they had family that defected, that was going to cause them a lot of problems. And so before we left, we had to create paperwork to say that we died in a car accident. So we actually, my entire family, me included, all died.
I'm sorry for your loss.
And so some of our relatives, some like the little kids who also, would tell all their friends, had to be told that they no longer had like a grandmother, or they didn't, they grew up, and then when they finally came to America, right, they were told that they still had these people, but officially we were, so I don't know, like those types of stories, if that poses any sort of like, oh, over in Russia, they'll start looking through records to see.
Well, I got to tell you, my first instinct was, wow, that's an amazing story. I think I'll steal it. And as a result, it actually made me think you can fictionalize it. The fact is, you don't have to use real names. That's exactly the kind of thing that if you're concerned, you can fictionalize it. I mean, the big joke at our house is I always say that the nesting dolls is not based on anyone living or dead. Really, I mean that. So as my oldest son said, oh, I see. Well, the character in the book, he's an African American who grew up in New York and went to Caltech, and dad is an African American who grew up in New York and went to MIT. I can see how they are totally different people. And it's the same sort of thing with you. I would write a story about totally different people that have absolutely no relationships to you living it up. But that's fascinating. That is exactly, I think that could make a great short story, or it could be turned into something broader. It could be done from the point of view of somebody who thought, their parents and their grandparents were dead, or maybe even a sibling, someone who was a child for whatever reason was left behind. It could be done that way. Or the flip side is it could be done from the point of view of someone who basically had to live knowing that somewhere else they were dead, and people thought that they were dead. I mean, that is a really, really interesting story. Thank you so much for sharing it. I hope I was able to answer your question in some way.
Thank you.
Yeah, things were a bit different by the time the 90s rolled around. I mean, that's true. The people I knew who we sponsored, a lot of families that came over in the late 80s, 90s, it was very much a different experience, which is, again, another reason why it's so important to write things down. Because, I hear from a lot of Americans, oh, yes, my grandparents immigrated in 1905. Yes, that's a story that bore very little relationship to those who immigrated in the 70s, with, the peak being in 79. And then those who came even 10 years later in 89, they were leaving a completely different country. The experience was completely different. They were coming to a different America. They were coming to one where there were a lot more people who had settled ahead of them. So absolutely, you're right. The 90s were a very different time. Do I ever schmooze with Gary Steingard? No, I've never met him. People have asked, but I've never met Gary Steingard. I think we'd have a lot in common. There's a great question from Irene, which is, what education do you recommend someone who wants to be a writer to get? And I have a very strong feeling about this, and it's very counterintuitive. And the main thing that I stress is, don't major in writing. Because the only thing that you learn by majoring in writing is how to write to please a particular professor. Now, the skill of learning to please a particular person who is the gatekeeper, either to pay you money or to accept your work, is a very important skill, but it's a very particular skill, and it can be learned by sending out your material and getting feedback from actual professionals in the field. I'm also, controversially, not a great fan of writing groups, because what usually happens in writing groups is you have 10 unpublished people telling 9 other unpublished people at a time what's wrong with their stories and how to get them published. And again, you can get that feedback by sending out your work to actual publishing professionals. So when people ask me, especially, very often I get asked, can you talk to my child and talk them out of becoming a writer? And I say, well, I can talk to your child. And I can certainly tell your child that if you don't love it, that if there's something else you possibly could do that you would love equally as much, you should do that. because writing is incredibly demoralizing if you enjoy getting rejected 5 times a day. And then when you actually get accepted, enjoy getting emails from people telling you you're stupid, then that's the field for you. Otherwise, go do something else. I mean, you don't have to be a computer programmer, but think about it. But the main thing is when they ask me, what should I major in college, is I tell them, major in history, major in sociology, major in anthropology, major in cognitive science, major in things that tell you how people act and why they act the way that they do. And if you want to major in something practical to tie into your writing career, major in marketing and public relations. Because the fact of the matter is, these days, as I like to say, I spend a third of my time trying to get work as a writer, a third of my time working as a writer, and the other third of my time promoting the writing work. Because now it doesn't matter. I mean, my publisher is HarperCollins. They're a major publisher, and they still expect you to do most of your own publicity and marketing. So think of it as being, you can open your own business. As a writer, you are your own business. And the most important thing is to publicize yourself. So if you want to major in something practical, think marketing, think business, because you're going to be filing your taxes as an independent contractor. So much fun. So that could actually be really useful. Or if you want to double that up with, as I said, history, sociology, anthropology, cognitive science, anything that just teaches you about people, then that's the way to go. Does that answer your question, Irene?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, actually, my daughter wants to be a script writer, not so much like a for the written media.
Oh, so she enjoys being rejected by better looking people.
I have no idea. But she's thinking to double major with psychology, possibly. Yeah. So
yeah,
we'll see.
That's definitely a good example.
Yes.
Yeah, there's also a question about my skating books, which, yes, they are on Kindle. They're out of print. All the print books, I don't have control over that. The publisher does. But you said your daughter is a former elite skater. What years? Because I spent a lot. I covered skating pretty much from 94 to about 2002. So that's just a curiosity question since you mentioned it, Natalia. Any other questions that people want to talk about either their own stories or maybe their parents or their grandparents' stories, or just tell us a story? I mean, here's the thing. I was one of those kids who, when I was little, when the adults were talking, I was always lurking by the side of the table, trying to eavesdrop. And a lot of those stories ended up being in the Nesting Dolls. So if you just have a story to tell me, I just love listening to stories. I will also tell you that usually in the past, who remembers the past when we would go out and hang out with people? If I was doing a book event, I would usually sign people's books for them. I can't do that, obviously, right now. But if you'd like to receive a book plate, which is a sticker that I sign and you can put in your book, if you could let someone at Cogeco, perhaps Alina, I'm volunteering you, know your name and address, I'm happy to drop one in the mail for you, because I really appreciate that people took the time to come and listen to me. And it feels weird. I'm used to being able to sign a book or to do something to really thank them. And if I can't do that, the least I can do is I can mail you a book plate.
We will be sending out an email to everyone who joined us tonight with information about your book and more information about upcoming Cogeco programs. So everyone could just respond to that email. And then we will pass that information on to you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So I seem to have filled my hour. So if there's anything else people would just like to ask in general, I'm here and I'm all ears.
Yeah, wanted to ask if your kids are interested in your family story and how to make our kids involved and to trigger their interest. Because I see that the middle generation, it's like a revolution, and they're interested on their family roots and genealogical stories and all that stuff. But how to make to transmit it to our children?
That is an excellent question. I'm going to tell you about how I failed in 3 completely different ways, and hopefully you'll be able to use some of that. My oldest son, we had a Russian babysitter when he was little, and so she would speak Russian to him and he would answer back, and he would be curious about why, my husband is American. So, why I spoke one language and why daddy spoke another one. And he's the one who then when he was 18, actually spent a year in Moldova on a State Department scholarship learning Russian. My husband called it the Junior Spies of America program. It's somebody I think has their mic open. Yeah. And it's not really a spy program, but it's for the study of vital languages. And those languages are Russian, Farsi, Korean. Vital for what? So he spent 10 months in well, I call it Kishinev, it's Chisinau now, studying Russian. And you know, he saw the house he was staying in was actually right across the street from the Jewish cemetery. And of course he learned about the pogrom of 1905 and all of that. So for him, it's kind of been intrinsic. It wasn't anything that I did. I do think exposing him to the language when he was young did make him curious about why I was so weird and so different from other parents, but it wasn't anything that I did. On the other hand, my second child absolutely refused to learn Russian. He blocked it out. The only 2 words he will respond to is "morozheno" and sometimes "polotyensa." I'm not sure why, but those are the only 2 words that he will acknowledge. So I cannot tell you anything because he has no interest. And then my daughter, who's 14, she goes to a Jewish day school. And this is not my pitch for Jewish day schools. You're welcome to send your children to any schools you like. I will tell you that they do a lot of focus on immigration and interview your parents, interview your grandparents. It was a lot more woven into the curriculum. So the kids, I mean, they may not have wanted to do it, but they had to do it. And once she actually had to do it, now she's aware of a lot of things. But as I said, the reason I put so many family stories into the Nesting Dolls is not only because it gave that kind of personalized detail, but because my father used to have an aunt who, if you left a cup too close to the edge of a table, she'd always move it and she'd say, "Someday when I'm dead, you'll remember me." And this is absolutely true. Whenever there's a cup on the edge of the table, we'll remember his Aunt Rahila. So the reason I'm telling this story is because someday I'll be dead and they'll pick up the book. I really do. And I think they will get a sense of who I am and who the family stories are. So this is me sort of going towards the future. As I said, I don't have any answers. I can tell you the 3 ways that I screwed up, and maybe people can use my experience to do something better.
Thank you. Yeah.
There's also a question about telling older Jewish stories, late 19th century or early 20th century, as popular as modern Soviet Russian stories. Historical is a huge category. So the fact is they do like publishing a lot of historical fiction. That time, that's really more popular. Like if you're going to do like a Fiddler on the Roof type thing, or if you're going to do the immigrants come to America and then work at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, I haven't seen anything really original about it or even anything really recent. It's more like World War II end up.
The story that I have, I'll just briefly say it, is my great-grandmother, who actually was Orthodox Hasidic, but was allowed to go to secular schools in her shtetl and get a secular education and learn to read and write and do all sorts.
Did she thank Stalin for it?
No, but it was weird because it was Chabad Hasidic and totally not expected from the 19th century to have a girl get so educated and do legal work. So that was.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. It's sort of like what you have there is a premise, not a story. So here's the thing, that in publishing, if anybody knew anything, every book would be Harry Potter. So the fact is they're always taking guesses, and just the fact that a book set in that time period hasn't made money before doesn't mean it won't make money in the future, but that is something they consider when you give them a pitch. There's also a question from Yulia. Do you think self-publishing parts of potentially larger work on a blog or Facebook or some other public platform would make it harder to publish it later with a publishing house? It's nice to get feedback on a work in progress on an open forum and just to share. Yes, absolutely. Are you familiar with Wattpad? There's a couple of different platforms out there where you can share your stories and you literally get thousands of people giving you feedback. And some people have gotten publishing deals. I mean, most of them have been young people writing about vampires, but the people have gotten publishing deals from that platform. If you do it on your own blog, then yes, publishers are a bit loath to invest in something that's already been available for free unless it went huge. I mean, there have been some people who have gotten offers if they've written a blog post that went viral and got millions of hits, then publishers would like you to expand that into a story. But if you've just been, like, say, publishing like episodes or a series on a blog and it hasn't blown up and gone big, publishers are less enthused about picking up something that's already been publicly available. But as far as feedback goes, there's Wattpad and there's similar platforms that are specifically for aspiring writers to develop their work and get feedback. So I remember feeling sad when I learned that my Americanized extended family exited. I assume that means exited 1912, didn't know any Russian and had almost no tradition in common with us. That absolutely sounds right to me, because there's such a huge difference between even the people who came before the 30s, or actually 1912, they came before the Soviet Union. And there were lots of Jews who lived in areas where they never had to learn Russian. There was really no reason for them. They lived in their own self-sufficient enclaves. They didn't have to deal with the Russians. And then those who grew up in Soviet times and especially had a lot of their traditions either stripped from them or forbidden for practicing the holidays and all of that, it's a whole different world. I absolutely agree. Do you have a book club discussion questions for your books? Yes, I do. And in fact, if you go to my website, it's alinaadams.com. Very easy. In fact, I'm going to type it in the box. For everybody, there's a discussion guide right there. And I love to talk to book clubs. And as you can tell, I am delightful and can talk endlessly. So if you'd like me to come to your book club, I am happy to do it. And I have questions on alinaadams.com, which I am typing in right now. Thank you for asking.
Any
All
other
right.
questions? My question, did you keep any traditions in your family? I mean, from your Russian childhood, like, let's say, Salat Olivier, kind of.
I never think of that as a tradition. I just think of that something that shows up on the table and there's really nothing you can do about it.
So your American husband likes it?
Well, okay. My American husband has a bit of a fear of beets. I think a little too much borscht in his life. So he is a little afraid of beets, but there's lots of things that he likes. So yeah, I don't think of food as a tradition. I know that it's for a lot of people that remember me, the kid who didn't eat or sleep for 3 years. Food and I have always had a complex relationship. But let's see, my American husband knows key phrases like "Itzen dritzen paravoz." And let's see, he also, whenever sometimes, we talk about the situation being difficult, he says, oh, we should bring a cow in here to live with us so that when we remove the cow, we feel better. So he's picked up some things. I don't know if that's exactly a tradition, but as he said, he's learned to just, when he sits at a table, his rule is when everybody else laughs, you laugh too. And then people ask him, do you speak Russian? And he goes, no.
Thank you. Okay.
What would you say? There's another quick question, which is, what would you say to your past? Oh, it's a goat. I'm sorry, Alana.
Yeah,
it's a goat.
Right, not a cow.
Well, maybe in our house it should be a cow. It's a New York apartment. It'll make it feel much more lived in. What would you say to your past self just starting out in this field? As I said, if you can do something else, do it. But if you can't, and I'm not saying that facetiously because I literally cannot do anything else, not just in a matter of skills, but in a matter of I can't not write. And this is actually a fabulous question to sort of round everything up in, because it ties up everything we've talked about. Find out what you have to say that's different from what other people had to say. I open with that. And I close it with that because that whole concept of your own voice. I don't know if any of you are particular fans of the composer Stephen Sondheim, but in his show Sunday in the Park with George, one of the lines is he says, I have nothing new to say that hasn't been said before. And the response is, make it come from you, then it will be new. If you just write a generic story that anyone else can write, it's unlikely that it's going to go anywhere. But if there's a story that only you can tell, and sometimes it takes a long time to find it. As I said, I wrote Regency romance novels and contemporary romance novels and figure skating murder mysteries and soap opera tie-ins. I was writing about white people living in a town in the Midwest. I just making things up. But really, you have to find what is the story that only you can tell, and then dig deep. You can write a surface story. You can write, and then we went to Chop, and then we went to Vienna, and then we went to Rome, and then we came to America, and those are words, but you have to think about what happened to me there, or to someone else. Feel free to steal. As I said to Will, I may steal his story. Feel free to steal from other people's stories that you've heard. A lot of the characters in my book, things happened to them that happened to my family, but also to friends and people that I heard. So find the story that only you can tell, and then don't be afraid to tell it. Because sometimes when things get intimate, people pull back because they're afraid of being judged. Now, if you're going to be a writer and you're afraid of being judged, don't do that, because there's no way to avoid it. But if you have the tough skin and you're willing to be honest, and honest doesn't have to mean, intimate things or sexual things or family secrets. It just means emotionally honest. If you can tell a story that only you can tell, and you can tell it in an emotionally honest way, that's how you're going to break through. That question is that something, how did you discover it? I pitched a lot of stories. Before I sold my first book, I must have had 5 or 6 complete manuscripts rejected, 300 pages that the editor said, oh, that's an interesting idea. Why don't you write it? And then I'd write 300 pages and they'd go, no, that's not as interesting. So you just got to keep throwing darts at the wall. You have no idea. As I said, if people in publishing knew what sold, every book would be Harry Potter.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. And Ala, will you close our meeting today?
Sure. Thank you everyone so much for joining us tonight. If this is your first time joining a program organized by Kajeko, please follow our page on Facebook. We have a page and a group. Please follow the page. That's where you get most updates on all the upcoming events. You could also check out our website, kajeko.org, that will have a calendar of events that will eventually still lead you back to Facebook. But is a good place, an easy place to find us. As I said earlier, we will send an email with our next upcoming Kajeko programs. Next week, we're taking a virtual tour with one of the edgiest and coolest tour guides of Tel Aviv, and it's also going to be on Tuesday night. And the week after, we're running a session, Igal is running a session on the Jewish roots of Cheburashka and Soviet Jews. You'll see all of that information in the email that you'll get. And just to put everything in the context, we are excited to be able to offer a number of different programs to our community for free. We do exist thanks to the support of our community. So if you're able and willing, please make a gift to Kajeko. We will send that link in the email as well. It would be very helpful for us to be able to run more of these programs in the future. And of course, buy Alina's book. Thank you everyone for joining, and have a good night.
Thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Yigal. Thank you, Alina, for having me.